Hello, Dragonkeeper19600 here, and welcome back to the aforementioned Dragonkeeper19600, which is me, reads Les Miserables. Yes. So, so yesterday I read the chapter, the comparatively very short chapter called An Upright Man. This one is much longer. It's the very next chapter called The Fall. So, no reason to mince words. Let's just start. Here we go. And I understand that I sometimes maybe read a little too fast, so I'll try to slow it down this video. So here we go. An hour before sunset, on the evening of a day in the beginning of October, 1815, a man traveling afoot entered the little town of Digne. The few persons who at this time were at their windows or their doors regarded this traveler with a sort of distrust. It would have been hard to find a passer-by more wretched in appearance. He was a man of middle height, stout and hardy, in the strength of maturity. He might have been 46 or 7. 47, not 7. That would be strange. A slouched leather cap half hid his face, bronzed by the sun and wind, and dripping with sweat. His shaggy breast was seen through the coarse yellow shirt, which at the neck was fastened by a small silver anchor. He wore a cravat twisted like a rope, coarse blue trousers, worn and shabby, white on one knee, and with holes in the other, and an old ragged grey blouse, patched on one side with a piece of green cloth sewed with twine. Upon his back was a well-filled knapsack, strongly buckled and quite new. In his hand he carried an enormous knotted stick. His stockingless feet were in hobnailed shoes, his hair was cropped, and his beard long. The sweat, the heat, the long walk, and the dust added an indescribable meanness to his tattered appearance. His hair was shorn, but bristly, for it had begun to grow a little, and seemed to have not been cut for some time. When he reached the corner of Rue de Poichevert, I'm just guessing there, I have no idea if that's how you pronounce it, he turned to the left and went around to the mayor's office. He went in, and a quarter of an hour afterward, he came out. There was then in Digne a good inn called La Croix de Colbert. Again, just a guess on the pronunciation. The traveler turned his steps toward this inn, which was the best in the place, and went at once into the kitchen, which opened out of the street. Weird place to put the kitchen, but whatever. All the ranges were fuming, and a great fire was burning briskly in the chimney place. Mine host, who was at the same time head cook, was going from the fireplace to the saucepans, very busy, superintending an excellent dinner for some wagoners who were laughing and talking noisily in the next room. Whoever has traveled knows that nobody lives better than wagoners. Nobody! A fat marmot, flanked by white partridges and goose, was turning on a long spit before the fire. Upon the ranges were cooking 2 large carps from Lake Lausanne and a trout from Lake Alloz. Again, guessing. The host, hearing the door open and a newcomer enter, said without raising his eyes from his ranges, "What will monsieur have?" "Something to eat and lodging." "Nothing more easy," said mine host, but on turning his head and taking observation of the traveler, he added, "For pay." The man drew from his pocket a large leather purse and answered, "I have money." "Then," said mine host, "I am at your service." The man put his purse back into his pocket, took off his knapsack, and put it down hard by the door, and holding his stick in his hand, sat down on a low stool by the fire. Digne being in the mountains, the evenings of October are cold there. However, as the host passed backward and forward, he kept a careful eye on the traveler. "Is dinner almost ready?" said the man. "Directly," said mine host. While the newcomer was warming himself with his back turned, the worthy innkeeper, Jacquin Labarre, that sounds right-ish, took a pencil from his pocket, and then tore off the corner of an old paper which he had pulled from a little table near the window. On the margin he wrote a line or two, folded it, and handed the scrap of paper to a child, who appeared to serve him as lackey and scullion at the same time. The innkeeper whispered a word to the boy, and he ran off in the direction of the mayor's office. The traveler saw nothing of this. He asked a second time, "Is dinner ready?" "Yes, in a few moments," said the host. The boy came back with the paper. The host unfolded it hurriedly, as one who is expecting an answer. He seemed to read with attention, then throwing his head on one side, thought for a moment. Then he took a step toward the traveler, who seemed drowned in troublous thought. "Monsieur," said he, "I cannot receive you. I have no room." "Well," responded the man, "a corner in the garret, a truss of straw. We will see about that after dinner. I cannot give you any dinner." This declaration, made in a measured but firm tone, appeared serious to the traveler. He got up. "Ah, I am dying with hunger." "I have nothing," said the host. The man burst into a laugh and turned toward the fireplace and the ranges. Nothing. And all that? All that is engaged. The man sat down again and said without raising his voice, I am at an inn, I am hungry, and I shall stay. The host bent down in his ear and said in a low voice which made him tremble, Go away. At these words, the traveller, who was bent over, poking some embers in the fire with the iron shalled end of his stick, turned suddenly around and opened his mouth as if to reply, when the host, looking steadily at him, added in the same low tone, Stop no more of that. It is my custom to be polite to all. Go. The man bowed his head, picked up his knapsack, and went out. He took the principal street. He walked at random, slinking near the houses like a sad and humiliated man. He did not once turn around. If he had turned, he would have seen the innkeeper of the Croix de Colbas standing in his doorway with all his guests, and the passers-by gathered about him, speaking excitedly and pointing him out, and from the looks of fear and distress which were engaged, he would have guessed that before long his arrival would be the talk of the whole town. Small-towners. He saw nothing of all this. People overwhelmed with trouble do not look behind. They know only too well that misfortune follows them. Excuse me. Yes, okay. He walked along in this way some time, going by chance down streets unknown to him, and forgetting fatigue, as is the case in sorrow. Suddenly he felt a pang of hunger. Night was at hand. Some children who had followed him from the Croix de Colbas threw stones at him. He turned angrily and threatened them with his stick, and they scattered like a flock of birds. He passed the prison. An iron chain hung from the door attached to a bell. He rang. The grating opened. Monsieur Turnkey, said he, taking off his cap respectfully, will you open and let me stay here tonight? A voice answered, A prison is not a tavern. Get yourself arrested, and we will open. The grating closed. Night came on apace. The cold alpine winds were blowing. He began to tramp again, taking his way out of the town, hoping to find some tree or haystack beneath which he could shelter himself. He walked on for some time, his head bowed down. When he thought he was far away from all human habitation, he raised his eyes and looked about him inquiringly. He was in a field. Before him was a low hillock covered with stubble, which after the harvest looks like a shaved head. Thanks for that. The sky was very dark. It was not simply the darkness of night, but there were very low clouds, which seemed to rest upon the hills and cover the whole heavens. A little of the twilight, however, lingered in the zenith, and as the moon was about to rise, these clouds formed in mid-heaven a vault of whitish light, from which a glimmer fell upon the earth. The earth was then lighter than the sky, which produces a peculiarly sinister effect, and the hill, poor and mean in contour, loomed out dim and pale upon the gloomy horizon. The whole prospect was hideous, mean, lugubrious, and insignificant. There was nothing in the field nor upon the hill but one ugly tree, a few steps from the traveller, which seemed to be twisting and contorting itself. Hair in my face. He retraced his steps. The gates of Digne were closed. He passed through a breach and entered the town. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening. As he did not know the streets, he walked at hazard. Soon he came to the prefecture, then to the seminary. On passing by the cathedral square, he shook his fist at the church. At the corner of this square stands a printing office. Exhausted with fatigue, and hoping for nothing better, he lay down on a stone bench in front of this printing office. Just then an old woman came out of the church. She saw the men lying there in the dark, and said, What are you doing there, my friend? He replied harshly, and with anger in his tone, You see, my good woman, I am going to sleep. The good woman, who really merited the name, was Madame la Marquise de... and the name is censored out, something starting with R. Upon the bench, said she, You cannot pass the night so. You must be cold and hungry. They should give you lodging for charity. I have knocked at every door. Well, what then? Everybody has driven me away. The good woman touched the man's arm and pointed out to him, on the other side of the square, a little low house beside the bishop's palace. You have knocked at every door? She asked. Yes. Have you knocked at that one there? No. Knock there. Drink. Dramatic pause. That evening, after his walk in the town, if I mess up on the word bishop, we're in trouble. The Bishop of Digne remained quite late in his room. He was busy with his great work on duty is capitalized here, which unfortunately is left incomplete. He carefully dissected all that the fathers and doctors have said on this serious topic. At 8 o'clock he was still at work, writing with some inconvenience on little slips of paper, with a large book open on his knees, when Madame Magloire, think that's how you pronounce that, as usual, came in to take the silver from the panel near the bed. A moment after, the bishop, knowing that the table was laid, and that his sister was perhaps waiting, closed his book and went into the dining room. The dining room was an oblong apartment with a fireplace, and with a door upon the street, as we have said, and a window opening into the garden. Madame Magloire had just finished placing the plates. While she was arranging the table, she was talking with Mademoiselle Baptistine. The lamp was on the table, which was near the fireplace, where a good fire was burning. I don't care, Victor. One can readily fancy these two women, both past their 60th year, Madame Magloire, small, fat, and quick in her movements, Mademoiselle Baptistine, sweet, thin, fragile, a little taller than her brother, wearing a silk puce-colored dress in the style of 1806, which she had bought it at the time in Paris, and which still lasted her. To borrow a common mode of expression, which has the merit of saying in a single word what a page would hardly express, Madame Magloire had the air of a peasant, and Mademoiselle Baptistine that of a lady. Just as the bishop entered, Madame Magloire was speaking with some warmth. She was talking to Mademoiselle upon a familiar subject, and one to which the bishop was quite accustomed. It was a discussion on the means of fastening the front door, meaning locking it. It seems that while Madame Magloire was out making provision for supper, she had heard the news in Sunday places. There was talk that an ill-favored runaway, a suspicious vagabond, had arrived and was lurking somewhere in the town, and that some unpleasant adventures might befall those who would come home late that night. Adventure! Then Mademoiselle Baptistine, endeavoring to satisfy Madame Magloire without displeasing her brother, ventured to say timidly, "Brother, do you hear what Madame Magloire says?" "I heard something of it distinctly," said the bishop. Then turning his chair half round, putting his hands on his knees, and raising toward the old servant his cordial and good-humoured face, which the firelight shone upon, he said, "Well, well, what is the matter? Are we in any great danger?" Then Madame Magloire began her story again, unconsciously exaggerating it a little. It appeared that a barefooted gypsy man, a sort of dangerous beggar, was in the town. He had gone for lodging to Jacquin Labarre, who had refused to receive him. He had been seen to enter the town by the Boulevard Gassendi, and to roam through the street at dusk. A man with a knapsack and a rope, and a terrible-looking face. "Indeed," said the bishop. This readiness to question her encouraged Madame Magloire. It seemed to indicate that the bishop was really well nigh alarmed. She continued triumphantly, "Yes, monsieur, it is true. There will something happen tonight in the town." Weird grammar, but okay. "Everybody says so. And I say, monseigneur, and mademoiselle says also." "Me," interrupted the sister. "I say nothing. Whatever my brother does is well done." Madame Magloire went on as she had not heard this protestation. "We say that this house is not safe at all, and if monseigneur will permit me, I will go and tell Pauline Massebois, I guess, the locksmith, stupid French language, to come and pat the old bolts in the door again. They are there, and it will take but a minute. I say we must have bolts, were it only for tonight, for I say that a door which opens by a latch on the outside to the first comer, nothing could be more horrible. Clearly she's never been to Canada. And then Monseigneur has the habit of always saying, 'Come in,' even at midnight. But my goodness, there is no need even to ask leave." At this moment there was a violent knock on the door. "Come in," said the bishop. The door opened. It opened quickly, quite wide, as if pushed by someone boldly and with energy. "Oh, yeah!" Sorry, clearly joke. A man entered. That man we know already. It was the traveler we have seen wandering about in search of lodging. Of a lodging. Yes. He came in, took one step, and paused, leaving the door open behind him. He had his knapsack on his back. I'm reading too fast again. His stick in his hand, and a rough, hard, tired, and fierce look in his eyes, as seen by the firelight. He was hideous. It was an apparition of ill omen. Hey, don't talk about Hugh Jackman that way. Madame Magloire had not even the strength to scream. She stood trembling with her mouth open. Mademoiselle Baptistine turned, saw the man enter, and started up, half alarmed. Then, slowly turning back again toward the fire, she looked at her brother, and her face resumed its usual calmness and serenity. The bishop looked upon the man with a tranquil eye. As he was opening his mouth to speak, doubtless to ask the stranger what he wanted, the man, leaning with both hands on his club, glanced from one to another in turn, and without waiting for the bishop to speak, said in a loud voice, "See here, my name is Jean Valjean. I am a convict. I have been 19 years in the galleys. 4 days ago I was set free and started from Pontarlier, which is my destination. During those 4 days I have walked from Toulon. Today I have walked 12 leagues. When I reached this place this evening, I went to an inn, and they sent me away on account of my yellow passport, which I had shown at the mayor's office, as was necessary. I went to the prison, and the turnkey would not let me in. I went to the fields to sleep beneath the stars. There were no stars. I thought it would rain, and there was no good God to stop the drops, so I came back to the town to get the shelter of some doorway. There in the square I lay down upon a stone. A good woman showed me your house and said, 'Knock there.' I have knocked. What is this place? Are you an inn? I have money, my savings, 109 francs and 15 sous, which I have earned in the galleys by my work for 19 years. I will pay. What do I care? I have money. I am very tired. 12 leagues on foot, and I am so hungry. Can I stay?" "Madame Legloire," said the bishop, "put on another plate." And that's that. The man took 3 steps and came near the lamp which stood on the table. "Stop!" he exclaimed, as if he had not been understood. "Not that. Did you understand me? I am a galley slave, a convict. I am just from the galleys. There is my passport, yellow, as you see. That is enough to have me kicked out wherever I go. There you have it. Everybody has thrust me out. Will you receive me? Is this an inn? Can you give me something to eat and a place to sleep? Have you a stable?" "Madame Legloire," said the bishop, "put some sheets on the bed in the alcove." Madame Legloire went to fulfill her orders. The bishop turned to the man. "Monsieur, sit down and warm yourself. You are going to take supper presently, and your bed will be made ready while you sup." At last the man quite understood. His face, the expression which till then had been gloomy and hard, now expressed stupefaction, doubt, joy, and became absolutely wonderful. He began to stutter like a madman. "True? What? You will keep me? You won't drive me away? A convict! You call me monsieur and don't say, 'Get out, dog,' as everybody else does. You are really willing that I should stay? You are good people. Besides, I have money. I will pay well. I beg your pardon, monsieur innkeeper. What is your name? I will pay all you say. You are a fine man. You are an innkeeper, ain't you?" I guess that's ain't. It's spelled weird. "I'm a priest who lives here," said the bishop. "Priest?" said the man. "Oh, noble priest. Then you do not ask any money? You are the curé, aren't you? The curé of this big church? Yes, that's it. How stupid I am. I didn't notice your cap." While speaking, he deposited his knapsack and stick in the corner, replaced his passport in his pocket, and sat down. Mademoiselle Baptistine looked at him pleasantly. He continued, "You are humane, monsieur curé. You don't despise me. A good priest is a good thing. Then you don't want me to pay you?" "No," said the bishop. "Keep your money." The bishop sighed deeply, just like I kind of did. The man continued, "As you are an abbé, I must tell you, we have an almoner in the galleys. And then one day I saw a bishop, Monseigneur they called him. It was the bishop of Major from Marseille. He is the curé who is over the curés. You see, beg pardon, how I bungle saying it, but for me it is so far off. You know what we are. He said mass in the center of the palace on an altar. He had a pointed gold thing on his head that shone in the sun. It was noon. We were drawn up in the line on 3 sides, with cannons and matches lighted before us. We could not see him well. He spoke to us, but he was not near us. We did not understand him. That is what a bishop is." While he was talking, the bishop shut the door, which he had left wide open. Madame Legloire brought in a plate and set it on the table. "Madame Legloire," said the bishop, "put this plate as near the fire as you can." Then turning toward his guest, he added, "The night wind is raw in the Alps. You must be cold, monsieur." Every time he said this word monsieur, with his greatly solemn and heartily hospitable voice, the man's countenance lighted up. Monsieur to a convict is a glass of water to a man dying of thirst at sea. Ignominy thirsts for respect. "The lamp," said the bishop, "gives a very poor light." Madame Magloire understood him, and going to his bedchamber, took from the mantel the 2 silver candlesticks, lighted the candles, and placed them on the table. "Monsieur Curé," said the man, "you are good. You don't despise me. You take me into your house, you light your candles for me, and haven't hid from you where I come from, and how miserable I am." The bishop, who was sitting near him, touched his hand evenly and said, "You do not need to tell me who you are. This is not my house. It is the house of Christ. It does not ask I messed that up, sorry. It does not ask any comer whether he has a name, but whether he has an affliction. You are suffering, you are hungry and thirsty, be welcome. And do not thank me, do not tell me that I take you into my house. This is the home of no man, except him who needs an asylum." Different connotation, folks. "I tell you, who are a traveler, that you are more at home here than I. Whatever is here is yours." And he means it. "What need have I to know your name? Besides, before you told me, I knew it." The man opened his eyes in astonishment. "Really? You knew my name?" "We did too, honey." "Yes," answered the bishop. "Your name is my brother." Stop, Monsieur Curé," exclaimed the man. "I was famished when I came in, but you are so kind now that I don't know what I am. That is all gone." The bishop looked at him again and said, "You have seen much suffering?" "Oh, the red blouse, the ball and chain, the plank to sleep on, the heat, the cold, the galley's crew, the lash, the double chain for nothing, the dungeon for a word, even when sick in bed, the chain, the dogs are happier. 19 years, and I am 46, and now a yellow passport. That is all. Yes, answered the bishop. You have left a place of suffering. But listen, there will be more joy in heaven over the tears of a repentant sinner than over the white robes of 100 good men. If you are leaving that sorrowful place with hate and anger against men, you are worthy of compassion. If you leave it with goodwill, gentleness, and peace, you are better than any of us. Meantime, Madame Magloire has served up supper. It consisted of a soup made of water, oil, bread, and salt, a little pork, a scrap of mutton, a few figs, a green cheese, and a large loaf of rye bread. What the heck is green cheese? Oh, well, it's French. It's probably good. She had, without asking, added to the usual dinner of the bishop a bottle of fine old Mauve's wine. Ooh. We are in France. The bishop's countenance was lighted up with this expression of pleasure, peculiar to hospitable natures. "To supper," he said briskly, as was his habit when he had a guest. He seated the man at his right. Mademoiselle Baptistine, perfectly quiet and natural, took her place at his left. The bishop said the blessing, and then served the soup himself, according to his usual custom. The man fell to, eating greedily. Suddenly the bishop said, "It seems to me something is lacking on the table." The fact was that Madame Magloire had set out only the 3 plates which were necessary. Now it was the custom of the house, when the bishop had anyone to supper, to set all 6 of the silver plates on the table, an innocent display. This graceful appearance of luxury was a sort of childlikeness which was full of charm in this gentle but austere household, which elevated poverty to dignity. Madame Magloire understood the remark, and without a word she went out, and a moment afterward the 3 plates for which the bishop had asked were shining on the cloth, symmetrically arranged before each of the 3 guests. And I'm sure putting out a bunch of silver in front of a guy just from jail will have no ill effects at all. I need another drink. Reading aloud is thirsty work. Okay, after having said good night to his sister, Monseigneur Bienvenu took one of the silver candlesticks from the table, handed the other to his guest, who fondled it for a while, doesn't say that in the book, and said to him, "Monsieur, I will show you to your room." "Do you want to stay in the tower?" The man followed him. As may have been understood from what has been said before, the house was so arranged that one could reach the alcove in the oratory only by passing through the bishop's sleeping chamber. Just as they were passing through this room, Madame Magloire was putting up the silver in the cupboard at the head of the bed. It was the last thing she did every night before going to bed. The bishop left his guests in the alcove, before a clean white bed. The man sat down the candlestick upon a small table. "Come," said the bishop, "a good night's rest to you. Tomorrow morning, before you go, you shall have a cup of warm milk from our cows." "Wow." "Thank you, Monsieur l'Abbé," said the man. Scarcely had he pronounced these words of peace, when suddenly he made a singular motion which would have chilled the 2 good women of the house with horror, had they witnessed it. He turned abruptly toward the old man, crossed his arms, and casting a wild look upon his host, exclaimed in a harsh voice, "Ah, now, indeed! You lodged me in your house, as near you as that." He checked himself and added, with a laugh, in which there was something horrible, "Have you reflected upon it? Who tells you that I am not a murderer?" The bishop responded, "God will take care of that." Then, with gravity, moving his lips like one praying or talking to himself, he raised 2 fingers of his right hand and blessed the man, who, however, did not bow, and without turning his head or looking behind him, went into his chamber. A few moments afterward, all in the little house slept. Yes. Let's drink. I'm taking a drink every time there's a break, because like the chapters have like little Roman numerals, so every time there's a Roman numeral, I pause. Swig, and we're good to go. Toward the middle of the night, Jean Valjean awoke. Sounds like me last night. Jean Valjean was born of a poor peasant family of Brie. In his childhood, he had not been taught to read. When he was grown up, he chose the occupation of a pruner at Faverolles. Jean Valjean was of a thoughtful disposition, but not sad, which is characteristic of affectionate natures. Upon the whole, however, there was something torpid and insignificant in the appearance, at least, of Jean Valjean. He had lost his parents when very young. My parents are dead! His mother died of malpractice in a milk fever. His father, a pruner before him, was killed by a fall from a tree. And then he was blown up in a silo explosion. Okay, sorry. Jean Valjean now had but one relative left, his sister, a widow with 7 children, girls and boys. This sister... Did she have a husband? This sister had brought up Jean Valjean, and as long as her husband lived, she had taken care of her younger brother. Her husband died, leaving the eldest of these children 8, the youngest 1 year old. Oh, God. Jean Valjean had just reached his 25th year. He took the father's place, and in his turn supported the sister who reared him. Thus he did naturally, as a duty, and even with a sort of moroseness on his part. His youth was spent in rough and ill-recompensed labor. He never was known to have a sweetheart. He had not the time to be in love. Sex? Who's got time for that? At night, he came in weary and ate his soup without saying a word. While he was eating, his sister, Marie-Jeanne, frequently took from his porringer the best of his meal, a bit of meat, a slice of pork, the heart of the cabbage, to give to one of her children. He went on eating, his head bent down nearly into the soup, his long hair falling over his dish, hiding his eyes. He did not seem to notice that anything was done. He earned in the pruning season 18 sous a day. After that, he hired out as a reaper, workman, teamster, or laborer. He did whatever he could find to do. His sister worked also, but what could she do with 7 little children? It was a sad group, which misery was grasping and closing upon. Little by little. There was a very severe winter. Jean had no work. The family had no bread, literally no bread, and 7 children. One Sunday night, Maubert Isabeau, the baker on the Place de l'Église in Faverolles, I probably pronounced that horribly, I'm sorry. Any of you who know French are probably smacking yourselves right now, sorry. Sorry for that too. Was just going to bed when he heard a violent blow against the barred window of his shop. He got down in time to see an arm thrust through the aperture made by the blow of a fist in the glass. He punched a window! Holy cow. That's awesome. The arm seized the loaf of bread and took it out. Isabeau rushed out. The thief used his legs valiantly. Isabeau pursued him and caught him. Don't mess with the baker, man. The thief had thrown away the bread, but his arm was still bleeding. It was Jean Valjean. All that happened in 1795. Jean Valjean was brought before the tribunals of the time for burglary at night in an inhabited house. He was found guilty. The terms of the code were explicit. In our civilization, there are fearful hours. Such are those when the criminal law pronounces shipwreck upon a man. What a mournful moment it is that in which society withdraws itself and gives up a thinking being forever. Jean Valjean was sentenced to 5 years in the galleys. He was taken to Toulon, at which place he arrived after a journey of 27 days on a cart, the chain still about his neck. It sounds miserable. At Toulon, he was dressed in a red blouse. All his past life is effaced, even his name. He was no longer Jean Valjean. He was number, everybody in the whole world, say it with me, 24601. Yes. What became of the sister? What became of the 7 children? Who troubled himself about that? What becomes of the handful of leaves of the young tree when it is sawn at the trunk? Here we go. Near the end of the 4th year, the chance of liberty came to Jean Valjean. His comrades helped him, as they always do in that dreary place, and he escaped. He wandered 2 days through the fields. During the evening of the 2nd day, he was retaken. He had neither eaten nor slept for 36 hours. The Maritime Tribunal extended his sentence 3 years for this attempt, which made 8. Okay, so 8 years now. In the 6th year, his turn of escape came again. He tried it, but failed again. He did not answer at roll call, and the alarm cannon was fired. At night, the people of the vicinity discovered him hidden beneath the keel of a vessel on the stocks. He resisted the galley guard which seized him. Escape and resistance. This the provisions of the special code punished by an addition of 5 years, 2 with the double chain. 13 years. The 10th year, his turn came round again. He made another attempt with no better chances. 3 years for this new attempt. 16 years. And finally, I think it was in the 13th year, he made another, and he was retaken after an absence of only 4 hours. 3 years for those 4 hours. 19 years. Oh my God. On October 1815, he was set at large. He had entered in 1796 for having broken a pane of glass and taken a loaf of bread. Jean Valjean entered the galleys, sobbing and shuddering. He went out heartened. He entered in despair. He went out sullen. What had been the life of this soul? I will answer that as soon as I get another drink. Yes. Let us endeavor to tell. It is an imperative necessity that society should look into these things. They are its own work. He was, as we have said, ignorant, but he was not an imbecile. The natural light was enkindled in him. Misfortune, which also has its illumination, added to the few rays that he had in his mind. Under the whip, under the chain, in the cell, in fatigue, under the burning sun of the galleys, upon the convict's bed of plank, he turned to his own conscience, and he reflected. He constituted himself a tribunal, meaning a trial. He began by arraigning himself. He recognized that he was not an innocent man, unjustly punished. He acknowledged that he had committed an extreme and blamable action, that the loaf, perhaps, would not have been refused him, had he asked for it, that at all events it would have been better to wait, either for pity or for work, that he should, therefore, have had patience, that it would have been better for those poor little ones, that it was an act of folly in him, a poor, worthless man, to seize society in all its strength, forcibly by the collar, and imagine that he could escape from misery by theft. That was, at all events, a bad door for getting out of misery by which one entered into infamy. In short, that he had done wrong. Then he asked himself, if he were the only one who had done wrong in the course of this fatal history, if, in the first place, it were not a grievous thing that he, a workman, should have been in want of bread, that he, an industrious man, should have lacked bread. If, moreover, the fault having been committed and avowed, the punishment had not been savage and excessive, if there were not a greater abuse on the part of the law in the penalty than there had been on the part of the guilty in crime, if the excess of penalty were not the effacement of the crime, and if the result were not to reverse the situation, to replace the wrong of the delinquent by the wrong of the repression, to make a victim of the guilty and a creditor of the debtor, and actually to put the right on the side of him who had violated it, he questioned himself if human society could have the right alike to crush its members, in the one case by its unreasonable carelessness, and in the other by its pitiless care. If it were not outrageous that society should treat with such rigid precision those of its members who were most poorly endowed in the distribution of wealth that chance had made, and who were, therefore, most worthy of indulgence. And I want you guys to pay attention to this, because this is still relevant today. These questions asked and decided, he condemned society and sentenced it. He sentenced it to his hatred. He made it responsible for the doom which he had undergone, and promised himself that he, perhaps, would not hesitate some day to call it to an account. And then, human society had done him nothing but injury. Never had he seen anything of her but this wrathful face which she calls justice, and which she shows to those whom she strikes down. No man had ever touched him but to bruise him. All his contact with men had been by blows. Never, since his infancy, since his mother, since his sister, never had he been greeted with a friendly word or a kind regard. Through suffering on suffering, he came little by little to the conviction that life was a war, and that in that war he was the vanquished. He had no weapon but his hate. He resolved to sharpen it in the galleys, and to take it with him when he went out. There was at Toulon a school for the prisoners conducted by some not very skillful friars, where the most essential branches were taught to those of the poor men as were willing. He was one of the willing ones. He went to school at 40, and learned to read, write, and cipher. He felt that to increase his knowledge was to strengthen his hatred. Under certain circumstances, instruction and enlightenment might serve as rallying points for evil. It is sad to say, but after having tried society, which had caused his misfortunes, he tried Providence, which created society, and condemned it also. Thus, during those 19 years of torture and slavery, did this soul rise and fall at the same time. Light entered on the one side, and darkness on the other. Jean Valjean was not, as we have seen, of an evil nature. His heart was still right when he arrived at the galleys. While there, he condemned society, and he felt that he became wicked. Thus, he condemned Providence, and felt he became impious. I think that's a typo. We must not omit one circumstance, which is, that in physical strength he far surpassed all the other inmates of the prison. At hard work, at twisting a cable, or turning a windlass, Jean Valjean was equal to 4 men. At one time, while the balcony of the City Hall of Toulon was undergoing repairs, one of Puget's and marble carriage, which support the balcony, slipped from its place and was about to fall, when Jean Valjean, who happened to be there, held it up on his shoulder till the workmen came. Wow. His suppleness surpassed his strength. Certain convicts, always planning escape, have developed a veritable science of strength and skill combined, the science of the muscles. A mysterious system of statics is produced throughout daily by prisoners, who are eternally envying the birds and flies. To scale a wall, and to find a foothold where you could hardly see a projection, was play for Jean Valjean. Given an angle in a wall, with the tension of his back and his knees, with elbows and hands braced against the rough face of the stone, he would ascend, as if by magic, to a 3rd story. So basically, Jean Valjean is Spider-Man. Not Wolverine. Sorry. Sometimes he climbed up in this manner to the roof of the galleys. He talked but little, and never laughed. Some extreme emotion was required to draw from him, once or twice a year, that lugubrious sound of the convict, which is like the echo of a demon's laugh. To those who saw him, he seemed to be absorbed in continually looking upon something terrible. He was absorbed, in fact. Through the diseased perceptions of an incomplete nature and a smothered intelligence, he vaguely felt that a monstrous weight was over him. In that pallid and sullen shadow in which he crawled, whenever he turned his head and endeavored to raise his eyes, he saw, with mingled rage and terror, forming, massing, and mounting up out of view above him with horrid escarpments, a kind of frightful accumulation of things, of laws, of prejudices, of men, and of acts, the outlines of which escaped him, the weight of which appalled him, and which was no other than that prodigious pyramid that we call civilization. If a millet seed under a millstone had thoughts, doubtless it would think what Jean Valjean thought. All these things, realities full of spectres, phantasmagoria full of realities, had at last produced within him a condition which was almost inexpressible. Sometimes in the midst of his work in the galleys, he would stop and begin to think. His reason, more nature, at the same time, perturbed more than formerly, would revolt. All that had happened to him would appear absurd. All that surrounded him would appear impossible. He would say to himself, "It is a dream." He would look at the jailer standing a few steps from him. The jailer would seem to be a phantom. All at once this phantom would give him a blow with his stick. For him, the external world had scarcely an existence. It would be almost true to say that for Jean Valjean there was no sun, no beautiful summer days, no radiant sky, no fresh April dawn. Some dim window light was all that shone in his soul. The beginning as well as the end of all his thoughts was hatred of human law, that hatred which, if it be not checked in its growth by some providential event, becomes in a certain time hatred of society, then hatred of the human race, and then hatred of creation, and reveals itself by a vague and incessant desire to injure some living being, it matters not who. So the passport was right, which described Jean Valjean as a very dangerous man. From year to year his soul had withered more and more, slowly but fatally. With this withered heart, he had a dry eye. When he left the galleys, he had not shed a tear for 19 years. I am thirsty. As the cathedral clock struck 2, Jean Valjean awoke. He had slept something more than 4 hours. His fatigue had passed away. He was not accustomed to give many hours to repose. Well, too close to the camera, sorry. He opened his eyes and looked for a moment into the obscurity about him, then he closed them to go to sleep again. When many diverse sensations have disturbed the day, when the mind is preoccupied, we can fall asleep once, but not a second time. Sleep comes at first much more readily than it comes again. Such was the case with Jean Valjean. He could not get to sleep again, and so he began to think. He was in one of those moods in which the ideas we have in our minds are perturbed. Many thoughts came to him, but there was one which continually presented itself, and which drove away all others. What that thought was, we shall tell directly. He had noticed the 6 silver plates in the large ladle that Madame Langlois had put on the table. Oops. Those 6 silver plates took possession of him. There they were, within a few steps. At the very moment that he passed through the middle room to reach the one he was now in, the old servant was placing them in a little cupboard at the head of the bed. We know, Victor, you told us that. He had marked that cupboard well, on the right, coming from the dining room. They were solid, and old silver. With the big ladle, they would bring at least 200 francs. His mind wavered a whole hour, and a long one, in fluctuation and in struggle. The clock struck 3. He opened his eyes, rose up hastily in bed, reached out his arm and filled his haversack, which he had put into the corner of the alcove. Then he thrust out his legs and placed his feet on the ground, and found himself, he knew not how, seated on his bed. He continued in this situation, and perhaps have remained there until daybreak, if the clock had not struck the quarter or the half hour. The clock seemed to say to him, "Come along." He rose to his feet, hesitated for a moment longer, and listened. All was still in the house. He walked straight and cautiously toward the window, which he could discern. The night was not very dark. There was a full moon, across which large clouds were driving before the wind. This produced alternations of light and shade, outdoors eclipses and illuminations, and indoors a kind of glimmer. On reaching the window, Jean Valjean examined it. It had no bars, opened into the garden, and was fastened, according to the fashion of the country, with a little wedge only. He opened it, but as the cold, keen air rushed to the room, he closed it again immediately. He looked into the garden with that absorbed look which studies rather than sees. The garden was enclosed with a white wall, quite low and readily scaled. Beyond, against the sky, he distinguished the tops of trees in equal distances apart, which showed that this wall separated this garden from an avenue, or a lane planted with trees. When he had taken this observation, he turned like a man whose mind is made up, went to his alcove, took his haversack, opened it, fumbled in it, took out something which he laid upon the bed, put his shoes into one of the pockets, tied up his bundle, swung it upon his shoulders, put on his cap, and pulled the visor down over his eyes, felt for his stick, and went and put it in the corner of the window, then returned to the bed, and took up the object which he had laid on it. It looked like a short iron bar, pointed at one end like a spear. It would have been hard to distinguish in the darkness for what use this piece of iron had been made. Could it be a lever? Could it be a club? In the daytime, it would have been seen to be nothing but a miner's drill. At that time, the convicts were sometimes employed in quarrying stone in the high hills that surrounded Toulon, and they often had miners' tools in their possession. Miners' drills are of solid iron, terminating at the lower end in a point, by means of which they are sunk into the rock. Yeah, we know what a drill is, thanks. He took the drill in his right hand, and holding his breath with stealthy steps, he moved toward the door of the next room, which was the bishop's, as we know. On reaching the door, he found it unlatched. The bishop had not closed it. You need some kind of security system, dude. I'm sorry. You just do. Okay. Jean Valjean listened. Not a sound. He pushed the door. He pushed it lightly with the end of his finger, with the stealthy and timorous carefulness of a cat. The door yielded to the pressure with a silent, imperceptible movement, which made the opening a little wider. He waited a moment, and then pushed the door again more boldly. This time, a rusty hinge suddenly sent out into the darkness a harsh and prolonged creak. He stood still, petrified like the pillar of salt, from the Bible, not daring to stir. Some minutes passed. The door was wide open. He ventured a look into the room. Nothing had moved. He listened. Nothing was stirring in the house. The noise of the rusty hinge had wakened nobody. This first danger was over, but he felt within him a frightful tumult. Nevertheless, he did not flinch. Not even when he thought he was lost had he flinched. His only thought was to make an end of it quickly. He took one step and was in the room. A deep calm filled the chamber. Jean Valjean advanced, carefully avoiding the furniture. At the furthest end of the room, he could hear the equal and quiet breathing of the sleeping bishop. Suddenly he stopped. He was near the bed. He had reached it sooner than he thought. Nature sometimes joins her effects and her appearances to our acts with a sort of serious and intelligent appropriateness, as if she would compel us to reflect. For nearly a half-hour, a great cloud had darkened the sky. At the moment when Jean Valjean had paused before the bed, the cloud broke as if purposely, and a ray of moonlight, crossing the high window, suddenly lighted up the bishop's pale face. He slept tranquilly. He was almost entirely dressed, though in bed, on account of the cold nights of the lower Alps, with the dark woolen garment which covered his arms to the wrists. His head had fallen on the pillow in the unstudied attitude of slumber. Over the side of the bed hung his hand, ornamented with the pastoral ring, and which had done so many good deeds, so many pious acts. His entire countenance was lit up with a vague expression of content, hope, and happiness. It was more than a smile and almost a radiance. On his forehead rested the indescribable reflection of an unseen light. The souls of the upright in sleep have a vision of a mysterious heaven. A reflection from this heaven shone upon the bishop. But it was also a luminous transparency, for this heaven was within him. This heaven was his conscience. At the instant when the moonbeam overlay, so to speak, this inward radiance, the sleeping bishop appeared as if in a halo, but it was very mild, and veiled in an ineffable twilight. The moon was in the sky, nature drowsing, the garden without a pulse, the quiet house, the hour, the moment, the silence, added something strangely solemn and unutterable to the venerable repose of this man, and enveloped his white locks and his closed eyes with a serene and majestic glory, this face where all was hope and confidence, this old man's head in infant slumber. There was something of divinity almost in this man, thus unconsciously august. Jean Valjean was in the shadow with the iron drill in his hand, erect, motionless, terrified at this radiant figure. He had never seen anything comparable to it. This confidence filled him with fear. The moral world has no greater spectacle than this, a troubled and restless conscience on the verge of committing an evil deed, contemplating the sleep of a good man. In a few moments he raised his left hand slowly to his forehead and took off his hat. Then, letting his hand fall with the same slowness, Jean Valjean resumed his contemplations, his cap in his left hand, his club in his right, and his hair bristling on his fierce-looking head. Under this frightful gaze, the bishop still slept in profoundest peace. The crucifix above the mantelpiece was dimly visible in the moonlight, apparently extending its arms toward both, with a benediction for one and a pardon for the other. Suddenly, Jean Valjean put on his cap, then passed quickly, without looking at the bishop, along the bed, straight to the cupboard which he perceived near its head. He raised the drill to force the lock. The key was in it. He opened it. The first thing he saw was the basket of silver. He took it, crossed the room with a hasty stride, careless of noise, reached the door, entered the oratory, took his stick, stepped out, put the silver in his knapsack, threw away the basket, ran across the garden, leaped over the wall like a tiger, and fled. So, yeah. Guy finally lets you in, treats you nicely, and you rob him. Nice going, Valjean. I have a crick in my shoulder. Did you hear that? Okay, here we go. Yeah. The next day at sunrise, Monseigneur Bienvenu was walking in the garden. Madame Magloire ran toward him, quite beside herself. "Monsieur, the man has gone! The silver is stolen!" While she was uttering this exclamation, her eyes fell on an angle of the garden where she saw traces of an escalade. A capstone of the wall had been thrown down. See! See! There is where he got out! He jumped into Cochefilet Lane! The abominable fellow! He has stolen our silver! The bishop was silent for a moment. Then, raising his serious eyes, he said mildly to Madame Magloire, "Now first, did the silver belong to us?" Madame Magloire did not answer. After a moment, the bishop continued, "Madame Magloire, I have for a long time wrongfully withheld this silver. It belonged to the poor. Who was this man? A poor man, evidently." "Alas, alas," returned Madame Magloire, "it is not on my account or mademoiselle's. It is all the same to us. But it is on yours, monseigneur. What is monsieur going to eat from now?" The bishop looked at her with amazement. "How so? Have we no tin plates?" Madame Magloire shrugged her shoulders. "Tin smells." "Well, then, iron plates." Madame Magloire made an expressive gesture. "Iron tastes." "Well," said the bishop, "then wooden plates." In a few minutes he was breakfasting at the same table at which Jean Valjean sat the night before. While breakfasting, Monseigneur Bienvenu pleasantly remarked to his sister, who said nothing, and Madame Magloire, who was grumbling to herself, that there was really no need even of a wooden spoon or fork to dip a piece of bread into a cup of milk. Just as the brother and sister were rising from the table, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," said the bishop. The door opened. A strange, fierce group appeared on the threshold. 3 men were holding a fourth by the collar. The 3 men were gendarmes. The fourth was Jean Valjean. A brigadier of gendarmes, who appeared to head the group, was near the door. He advanced toward the bishop, giving a military salute. "Monseigneur," said he. At this word, Jean Valjean, who was sullen and seemed entirely cast down, raised his head with a stupefied air. "Monseigneur," he murmured, "then it is not the curé." "Silence," said the gendarme. "It is Monseigneur the bishop." In the meantime, Monseigneur Bienvenu had approached as quickly as his great age permitted. "Ah, there you are," said he, looking at Jean Valjean. "I am glad to see you. But I gave you the candlesticks also, which are silver like the rest, and would bring 200 francs. Why did you not take them along with your plates?" Jean Valjean opened his eyes and looked at the bishop with an expression which no human tongue could describe. So he doesn't bother and moves on. "Monseigneur," said the brigadier, "then what this man said was true? We met him. He was going like a man who was running away, and we arrested him in order to see. He had this silver." "And he told you," interrupted the bishop with a smile, "that it had been given him by a good old priest with whom he had passed the night? I see it all. And you brought him back here? It is all a mistake." "If that is so," said the brigadier, "we can let him go." "Certainly," replied the bishop. The gendarmes released Jean Valjean, who shrank back. "Is it true they let me go?" he said in a voice almost inarticulate, as if he were speaking in his sleep. "Yes, you can go. Do you not understand?" said a gendarme. "My friend," said the bishop, "before you go away, here are your candlesticks. Take them." He went to the mantelpiece, took the 2 candlesticks, and brought them to Jean Valjean. The 2 women beheld the action without a word, or gesture, or look, that might disturb the bishop. Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb. He took the 2 candlesticks mechanically, and with a wild appearance. "Now," said the bishop, "go in peace." Then turning to the gendarmes, he said, "Messieurs, you can retire." The gendarmes withdrew. Jean Valjean felt like a man who was just about to faint. The bishop approached him and said to him in a low voice, "Forget not, never forget that you have promised to use this silver to become an honest man." Jean Valjean, who had no recollection of this promise, stood confounded. The bishop had laid much stress upon these words as he uttered them. He continued solemnly, Jean Valjean, my brother, you belong no longer to evil but to good. It is your soul that I am buying for you. I withdraw it from dark thoughts and from the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. Jean Valjean went out of the city as if he were escaping. He made all haste to get into the open country, taking the first lanes and bypaths that offered, without noticing that he was every moment retracing his steps. He wandered thus all the morning. He had eaten nothing, but he felt no hunger. He was the prey of a multitude of new sensations. He felt somewhat angry, he knew not against whom. He could not have told whether he were touched or humiliated. He saw, with disquietude, shaken within him that species of frightful calm which the injustice of his fate had given him. He asked himself what should replace it. Although the sensation was well advanced, there were yet here and there a few late flowers in the hedges, the odor of which, as it met him in his walk, recalled the memories of his childhood. These memories were almost insupportable. It was so long since they had occurred to him. Unspeakable thoughts thus gathered in his mind the whole day. As the sun was sinking toward the horizon, lengthening the shadow on the ground of the smallest pebble, Jean Valjean was seated behind a thicket in a large reddish plain, an absolute desert. There was no horizon but the Alps. Not even the steeple of a village church. Jean Valjean might have been 3 leagues from Digne. A bypath which crossed the plain passed a few steps from the thicket. In the midst of this meditation he heard a joyous sound. He turned his head and saw coming along a path a little Savoyard, which means chimney sweep, 12 years old, singing with his hurdy-gurdy at his side and his marmot box on his back. I have no idea what that means. I'm sorry. One of those pleasant and gay youngsters, meaning happy, not the other thing, who go from place to place with their knees sticking through their trousers. Always singing, the boy stopped from time to time and played at tossing up some pieces of money that he had in his hand, probably his whole fortune. Among them there was 1 40-sous piece. The boy stopped by the side of the thicket without seeing Jean Valjean and tossed up this handful of sous. Until this time he had skillfully caught the whole of them upon the back of his hand. This time the 40-sous piece escaped him and rolled toward the thicket, near Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean put his foot upon it. The boy, however, had followed the piece with his eye and had seen where it went. He was not frightened, and walked straight to the man. It was an entirely solitary place. Far as the eye could reach, there was no one on the plain or on the path. Nothing could be heard but the faint cries of a flock of birds of passage that were flying across the sky at an immense height. The child turned his back to the sun, which made his hair like threads of gold, flushed the savage face of Jean Valjean with a lurid glow. Monsieur, said the little Savoyard with that childish confidence which is made up of ignorance and innocence, my piece? What is your name? Said Jean Valjean. Petit Gervais, monsieur. Get out, said Jean Valjean. Monsieur, continued the boy, give me my piece. Jean Valjean dropped his head and did not answer. The child began again. My piece, monsieur. Jean Valjean's eye remained fixed on the ground. My piece, exclaimed the boy. My white piece, my silver. Jean Valjean did not appear to understand. The boy took him by the collar of his blouse and shook him, and at the same time he made an effort to move the big iron-soled shoe which was placed upon his treasure. I want my piece, my 40-sous piece. The child began to cry. Jean Valjean raised his head. He still kept his seat. His look was troubled. He looked upon the boy with an air of wonder, then reached out his hand toward his stick and exclaimed with a terrible voice, Who is there? Ah, you here yet? And rising hastily to his feet, without releasing the piece of money, he added, You'd better take care of yourself. The boy looked at him in terror, then began to tremble from head to foot, and after a few seconds of stupor, took to his flight and ran with all his might without daring to turn his head or to utter a cry. Nice going. At a little distance, however, he stopped for want of breath, and Jean Valjean in his reverie heard him sobbing. In a few minutes the boy was gone. The sun had gone down. The shadows were deepening around Jean Valjean. He had not eaten during the day. Probably he had some fever. He had remained standing, and had not changed his attitude since the child fled. His breathing was at long and unequal intervals. His eyes were fixed on a spot 10 or 12 steps before him, and seemed to be studying with profound attention the form of an old piece of blue crockery that was lying in the grass. All at once he shivered. He began to feel the cold night air. He pulled his cap down over his forehead, sought mechanically to fold and unbutton his blouse around him, stepped forward, and stooped to pick up his stick. At that instant he perceived the 40-sou piece which his foot had half buried in the ground, and which glistened among the pebbles. It was like an electric shock. "What is that?" said he, between his teeth. He drew back a step or two, then stopped without the power to withdraw his gaze from this point which his foot had covered the instant before, as if the thing that glistened there in the obscurity had been an open eye fixed upon him. After a few minutes he sprang convulsively toward the piece of money, seized it, and, rising, looked away over the plain, straining his eyes toward all points of the horizon, standing and trembling like a frightened deer which is seeking a place of refuge. He saw nothing. Night was falling. The plain was cold and bare. Thick purple mists were rising in the glimmering twilight. He said, "Oh," and began to walk rapidly in the direction in which the child had gone. After some 30 steps he stopped, looked about, and saw nothing. Then he called with all his might, "Petit Charvet! Petit Charvet!" And then he listened. There was no answer. The country was desolate and gloomy. On all sides was space. There was nothing about him but a shadow in which his gaze was lost, and a silence in which his voice was lost. A biting norther was blowing, which gave a kind of dismal life to everything about him. The bushes shook their little thin arms with incredible fury. One would have said that they were threatening and pursuing somebody. Thanks for that. He began to walk again, then quickened his pace to a run, and from time to time stopped and called out in that solitude, in a most desolate and terrible voice, "Petit Charvet! Petit Charvet!" Surely if the child had heard him, he would have been frightened, and would have hid himself. But doubtless the boy was already far away. Jean Valjean began to run again in the direction which he had first taken. He went on in this wise for a considerable distance, looking around, calling and shouting, but met nobody else. 2 or 3 times he left the path to look at what seemed to be somebody lying down or crouching, but it was only low bushes or rocks. Finally, at a place where 3 paths met, he stopped. The moon had risen. He strained his eyes in the darkness and called out once more, "Petit Charvet! Petit Charvet! Petit Charvet?" His eyes died away into the mist, without even awakening an echo. Again he murmured, "Petit Charvet," but with a feeble and almost inarticulate voice. That was his last effort. His knees suddenly bent under him, as if an invisible power overwhelmed him at a blow. With the weight of his bad conscience, he fell exhausted upon a great stone, his hands clenched in his hair, and his face on his knees, and exclaimed, "What a wretch I am!" Then his heart swelled, and he burst into tears. It was the first time he had wept in 19 years. Jean Valjean wept long. He shed hot tears. He wept bitterly, with more weakness than a woman, with more terror than a child. While he While he wept, the light grew brighter and brighter in his mind, an extraordinary light, a light at once transporting and terrible. His past life, his first offense, his long expiation, his brutal exterior, his hardened interior, his release made glad by so many schemes of vengeance, what had happened to him at the bishop's, his last action, this theft of 40 sous from a child, a crime meaner and the more monstrous that it came after the bishop's pardon, all this returned and appeared to him clearly, but in a light that he had never seen before. He beheld his life, and it seemed to him horrible, his soul, and it seemed to him frightful. There was, however, a softened light upon that life and upon that soul. It seemed to him that he was looking upon Satan by the light of paradise. How long did he weep thus? What did he do after weeping? Where did he go? Nobody ever knew. It is known simply that, on that night, the stage driver who drove at that time on the Grenoble route and arrived at Digny, about 3 o'clock in the morning, saw, as he passed through the Bishop's Street, a man in the attitude of prayer kneel upon the pavement of the shadow, before the door of Monseigneur Bienvenu.
What have I done, sweet Jesus, what have I done? Become a thief in the night, become a dog on the run. Have I fallen so far, and is the hour so late that nothing remains but the cry of my hate? The cries in the dark that nobody hears, here where I stand at the turning of the years. If there's another way to go, I missed it 20 long years ago. My life was a war that could never be won. They gave me a number and murdered Valjean when they chained me and left me for dead, just for stealing a mouthful of bread. Why did I allow that man to touch my soul and teach me love? He treated me like any other. He gave me his trust. He called me brother. My life he claims for God above. Can such things be? For I had come to hate the world, this world that always hated me. Take a knife for an eye, turn your heart into stone. This is all I have lived for. This is all I have known. From him and I'd be back beneath the lash upon the rack. Instead he offers me my freedom. I feel my shame inside me like a knife. He told me that I had a soul. How does he know what spirit comes to move my life? Is there another way to go? I am reaching, but I fall, and the night is closing in, and I stare into the void, to the whirlpool of my sin. I'll escape now from the world of Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean is nothing